So Australian investors are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, a whole host of other incentives that were meant to reshore a lot of these industrial-based capabilities, particularly around critical minerals and materials and defense supply chain, defense production, right? These are the most central aspects of all this government support in the US. And so as that began to pick up steam and recognizing that those applications would require US-based production.
Hello, and welcome to TSN's ASX Investor Podcast, Stocktails. I'm your host, Russell Katz. All thoughts, opinions, and analysis expressed on the show should not be used as an excuse to avoid doing your own research. Because remember, being lazy never earned anybody any money. A more detailed disclaimer is available at the end of the show. But for now, let's dive into today's exciting episode featuring Hank from Amaero, ticker code 3DA. Amaero combines powder metallurgy with specialized technology to deliver exceptional materials and a new standard in advanced material and manufacturing. 2023 was a busy year for Amaero, successfully moving operations to Tennessee in the United States, and ordering the first atomizer for the facility. Part of the move including transitioning to a focus on small batch alloys, specifically C103. As 2024 begins, Amaero has been hard at work, and here to tell us all about it is the company's CEO, Hank. Hank, welcome to Stocktails.
Yeah, and thanks, Russell, for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the big picture? What exactly attracted you to Amaero to begin with? Because, you weren't the founder of the company. You actually came in and made a lot of changes. So can you just tell me what exactly attracted you to Amaero to start with?
It's an interesting question. So Pegasus and myself got involved in May of 2022. So we're coming up on 2 years ago. And we've always been a thematic investor. And the theme that drew me to look for a materials company that could be stood up as a platform investment was this notion, COVID, and then following that, Ukraine conflict. It became abundantly clear to me that globalization as I've known it, which is all I've known in my entire career, is over. And I now spend the rest of my career winding the clock backwards. And in particular, the US and its allies must reshore these critical industrial-based capabilities that have been outshored over time, right, over the last decades, if you will, for a lot of reasons that had short-term expedient gains, i.e. deflation, but left the US and its allies very vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and economic shocks. And that's really what drew me to Amaero.
So the Amaero wasn't focusing on hypersonics beforehand, but that's definitely a key aspect of your pitch. Now, what was behind your decision to shift the focus of the company to hypersonics?
Yeah, and I would say it's even broader than that. So when I first got involved, Amaero, which had spun out of Monash University, was really focused on commercializing 3D printing or metal additive manufacturing. So taking its expertise in material science, taking its expertise in developing parameters for various equipment OEM printing machines, and then doing commercialization work for the likes of Boeing and so forth, if you will. They had ordered a single atomizer, planning to begin a business in powder production. And think of powder not unlike a Hewlett-Packard printer that you've got your ink cartridge. So essentially the powder is the ink cartridge for these 3D printing machines. When I got involved, that was really my interest was, we're at a critical tipping point as far as the adoption for advanced 3D printing, advanced additive manufacturing, particularly for metals. And the choke point in the supply chain are the materials, is the powder. At the very same time when I got involved, I quickly determined that a single atomizer, which is what had been planned, was not a sufficient scale, number one. Number two, unfortunately, I determined that Victoria is a very cost-prohibitive place to do business. I spent 27 years of my career in California. In California is much the same when you compare it to other more pro-business states such as Texas or Tennessee or Ohio or the Carolinas or Arizona or Utah. There's just certain challenges about operating in a place like California. And I found the same to be true in a place like Victoria.
There was also electricity costs, right? I mean, that was one of the other things as well, because your process involves, is rather electricity intensive. And one of your main costs going forward is going to be electricity. And you got this great deal in Tennessee.
Exactly right,
if I remember.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Our largest cost of goods is the feedstock bar itself. Our second largest cost of goods is argon gas, and the third is electricity. And we signed a 10-year subsidized electricity contract with Tennessee Valley Authority. at what will likely be a 75 to 80% discount of what our rates would have been in Victoria. So a significant savings, not only a very significant savings where we would have been in Australia, but a significant savings and competitive advantage even within the US. On top of this, by the way, it's clean generation of power. So it tends to be natural gas or nuclear. And so from that standpoint, it's a positive as well. To your question about hypersonics, and sometimes you get lucky, right? You try to make the best strategic decisions that you can to position the company in a competitive position. And then sometimes you get lucky. And that was our case, I would say, with hypersonics and some of these next generation defense applications. Once we announced we were relocating to Tennessee and we began to involve ourselves more closely with some of the government funded labs, both Oak Ridge National Lab, which happens to be in Tennessee, and some of the Department of Defense labs, such as Air Force Research Lab, it became apparent that there was a shortage of US domestic sources for refractory and other high-value specialty powders. Refractory is important in that refractory alloys such as niobium, moly, tungsten, rhenium, and so forth tend to be used in these very high temperature applications. And it so happens if you look at the next generation applications, the two most pressing on the defense side are hypersonics, as you mentioned, but also strategic missiles. And I'll expand upon this. These are critical materials. By the way, interesting and unique about this investment opportunity, not often do you have a very large secular investment trend, such as we have in hypersonics and strategic missiles, as I described. But in parallel and uncorrelated to that, you've got this very large secular trend in space. So in launch vehicles as well as satellite systems, both of which also have these high temperature applications. The high temperature applications in both cases tend to be thermal protection. So in the case of hypersonic strategic missiles, as you re-enter, right, the atmosphere and going at Mach 5, Mach 6, Mach 7 speeds, okay, you create a lot of friction, a lot of surface temperature, and thus you need this thermal protection, if you will, at the very same time in the propulsion system. So whether that's a thruster, or whether that's a nozzle, you've got very, very, very high temperatures, and you're trying to burn these engines and these rockets, if you will, hotter, to go faster, and then, of course, also with the objective of going deeper in space as it relates to the space side. And so it was really, in the textbook sense, a demand pull. It wasn't that we were so smart we set out to build a business in refractory. We set out to build a powder business with great capability and one that could be very flexible. And that in turn positioned us to take care of this opportunity that emerged within refractory.
So did the opportunity emerge as part of the conversations with the Tennessee government and other government contacts when you were looking to where to move? Because Tennessee wasn't necessarily your first choice. You also looked into moving into Dubai as well, but Tennessee managed to beat the energy costs there. So was the energy cost really the overriding reason that you moved to Tennessee? And then a lot of these other opportunities kind of presented themselves going forward? Or was this all kind of part of the plan when you initially decided?
Yeah, no, I would say the energy cost was a tertiary consideration. And as you mentioned, I've got another business that I'm involved in Dubai. And one of the benefits right now, the United Arab Emirates, is A, it's considered geopolitically neutral. And B, of course, there's an abundance of capital, right? Capital formation is much more attractive and much more cost competitive than it would be in Australia or even in the US for that matter. And so that's what drove us to the UAE. And we spent 9 months and we were about 6 weeks away from greenlighting a project over there. The UAE had agreed to build and capitalize all the cost of a 160,000 square foot facility, both construction cost and 100% of fit out. Okay, all of which would be capitalized with no equity requirement on our part. In addition to that, Emirates Development Bank had agreed to finance 60% of all our capital expenditures. So it was very, very attractive. We were going that direction. Why then did we instead go to the US? And the premise is quite simple. It should have perhaps been obvious sooner than it was, but nonetheless, it began to pick up momentum very quickly. And that was this reshoring theme in the US. What began in the Trump administration and accelerated in the Biden administration with presidential executive orders, as well as appropriations from Congress. So Australian investors are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, a whole host of other incentives that were meant to reshore a lot of these industrial-based capabilities, particularly around critical minerals and materials and defense supply chain, defense production, right? These are the most central aspects of all this government support in the US. And so as that began to pick up steam and recognizing that those applications would require US-based production, right? Given my longstanding relationships in the US, both in the political sphere as well as in the capital markets, we circled back, and as you alluded to, we actually spoke to 6 states, beginning with West Virginia, South Carolina, Texas, Arizona, Utah, and the last of which was Tennessee. And this will give you an example of how business can get done in a place like Tennessee versus a place like Victoria or California. We signed binding contracts 5 weeks after our first meeting with counterparties in Tennessee. In 5 weeks, we signed binding contracts, including a brand new 100,000 square foot or 9,300 meter facility that was just being finished, that was built on a spec basis to attract a company like Amaero. And so in doing so, it accelerated our path to market by 18 to 24 months, and it mitigated all the risk associated with building a building.
So, on that note, it sounds, as you kind of alluded to, the area that you're in is rather conducive to innovation. And, we kind of mentioned before the partnerships with Defense Labs and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is funded by the Department of Energy. Can you just talk a little bit about what those partnerships gain you? For example, I know that you guys are actually working on creating the actual specs that will be used for hypersonics going forward, but that's being funded by some of these labs, right? You guys aren't actually having to pay that. Well, your competitors are going to have to pay to develop that on their own.
Yeah, it's a great point, Russell. And again, it really shows you in the US, and we have the same structural bifurcation, if you will, right? The cost of operating, the inefficiencies of doing business in a place like California or the state of New York for that matter, right? These older coastal economies where you have older infrastructure, higher taxation, a lot of competitive disadvantages compared to the Southeast and the middle of the country, which has really become the manufacturing renaissance of the US. And so there's a lot of reasons to be in Tennessee that are very beneficial, as well as that entire Tennessee Valley area, which would include, for example, parts of Alabama and so forth, where you've got a lot of space presence and so forth. The benefits are many. You've got a lot of aerospace and defense industry, right, hubbed in that entire area. The background industry in the particular county that we're in Tennessee is foundry. So going back to the steel days, you've got a lot of foundry, and thus from a job standpoint, a jobs trading standpoint, an availability of labor standpoint, the ability again to get things done in a quick manner, right? 2, we literally are on Interstate 75. Interstate 75 is the most heavily trafficked interstate highway in the US for logistics traffic, for trucking. We're literally on Interstate 75. 2 exits from us is a 650,000 square foot facility of Volkswagen. Across the street from us is Cleveland Cliffs, who's stamping parts for Volkswagen, right? And so you've got a lot of industry in this area. In particular, there's 3 industries Tennessee is really bet on. It's got a large EV industry. So as we transition from internal combustion engines to electric motors, that is, you've got a big EV battery industry in Tennessee. You've got a large material industry in Tennessee. I said they come from a foundry background, if you will. And then on top of that, as it relates to nuclear energy, you've got a significant industry in Tennessee. Alluding to your point, Oak Ridge National Lab is, which is where the Manhattan Project essentially began, right? It was Sandia in New Mexico, and then the actual work itself was at Oak Ridge National Lab. A very, very, very well-respected lab as it relates to advanced manufacturing. Works closely with defense-funded labs such as Air Force Research Lab, Army Research Lab, Navy, et cetera. And as you said, these next generation projects, be it hypersonics or strategic missiles, the way these projects happen, they're very long-lived, and you'll go into a multi-year period of development and demonstration, which will be the first phase of procurement. And then once you get through that development demonstration, as you said, you then have specs for the project. right? And along the way, they will select the manufacturers that will be contracted with for serial production. And so
Mhm.
for us to have a chance to be involved in this development and demonstration phase of these projects, and for us to have a chance to be a US domestic supplier, right, of an advanced material of which there's critical shortage of in the US, refractory powder, it positioned us in a very unique way to partner both with industry as well as defense labs, and in a very interesting way to have our imprint, if you will, on this development and demonstration phase.
Fantastic. And just on that note, actually, so what exactly are you expecting to see in the near term? Let's say the next 6 months. What exactly milestones should investors be looking at? Because I know that you've said before, we're not going to talk about MOUs. We're going to talk about offtake agreements. You're very open with the market. You are constantly updating them. So, and I don't think you've missed a milestone yet as your tenure in control of Amaero. So, what exactly should investors be really kind of eyeballing on the calendar for the next 6 months?
Yeah, and what we've tried to do, Russell, and it's a simple principle. I try to communicate with investors the way that I would want to be communicated with, right? And as I've always said, I feel enormous fiduciary obligation to our long-term shareholders. Candidly, I feel no obligation to our short-term traders of the stock. It doesn't really matter to me where the stock price is today or next week or next month. Our singular focus is building long-term shareholder value and executing on milestones and trying to communicate those milestones in a transparent and balanced manner. So we're not spending a lot of time talking to investors about what's to come, other than try to give them reasonable milestones that position them to judge us, right? Are we doing a good job from an execution standpoint, right? And giving some sense of, okay, here are the next execution steps that we're focused on. As you said, we don't have a practice of sharing LOIs or MOUs or things such as that. What we've said to the market as far as next is a week from Monday, we begin installation of the atomizer. That's important. We've said to the market that we are advancing discussions as it relates to commercial offtake agreements. That's important. We've said to the market that we anticipate commissioning our first atomizer in June and beginning production in the first quarter of the fiscal year, beginning commercial sales in what would be the third quarter of the fiscal year, the first quarter of next calendar year 2025. So if you think about it, 2023, a lot of important work happened. It's probably the hardest I've worked in my entire career. But the challenge of a year like 2023 is it was mostly restructuring, resetting corporate strategy. There weren't a lot of tangible milestones. Yes, we relocated to Tennessee. Yes, we signed a lease on a facility. Yes, we made key hires. Yes, we set our production strategy going forward. But now going into 24, we'll have much, what I would say, a quicker cadence of more tangible milestones, such as I just described. And hopefully that will also be something that will facilitate more interest on the investor side. I think we've had a very narrow part of the market that even knows who we are today. And certainly one would hope to not only go deeper with those investors over time, but to have a wider awareness over time with the investor community as well.
So it sounds like what you're kind of saying is that 2023 was kind of building the bedrock. 2024 is going to be building the storefront itself, and 2025 is when you do the soft launch and kind of scale up from there.
That's right. And 2025 will be the year that we begin to have revenue. We begin to have, investors can get a sense of our structural operating margins and so forth. And look, at the end of the day, that's what businesses should be valued on, right? Where will this business be valued in 2026 by way of example? At some discount to its 2027 earnings, right?
Yeah.
But in the interim, we've got to get there. And so one of the things that we're trying to be very, very disciplined about, I think we've done a pretty good job, is mitigating and minimizing the OpEx required to get there, to be very disciplined with our use of capital, to be very disciplined with our CapEx spend. And moreover, we've taken an approach that I've come to find is perhaps a bit unusual in the ASX, being really transparent about what our out years of CapEx spending is, right? I want investors to understand what our capital investment plan and our funding needs will be to get to a fully at capacity funded strategy, right? And again, we've tried to be very forthcoming in that right as well.
And let's just kind of jump back for a sec to the last capital raise, which you took 40%, 4 million of, Pegasus took themselves. And I know that so you're really putting your money where your mouth is. So when you're saying we want to reduce OpEx as much as possible, you're really talking about your own pocket. You want to reduce your own dilution. So you were talking about that. 2023 is probably the hardest you ever worked in your life. But that had a lot to do with the fact that you really have a large piece of this business. You're very, some people might be a little concerned about you being from the States or based in the States. But the truth of the matter is nobody is more invested in this business succeeding from a pure monetary standpoint.
So I think it's one of the great and interesting things about the story. And it would be not as uncommon in the US. I've come to find it's very uncommon in Australia. I follow a lot of other companies in Australia, and I see CEOs that own less than 1% of the stock, and the 1% they own was given to them in options, right? They maybe haven't written a single check to buy stock, right? In this case, as you said, Pegasus has now led 3 capital raises going back to May of 22. The capital raise a bit over a year ago, we took 70% of.
Wow.
Right? The most recent capital raise, we took 40% of. Pegasus owns 40% of the shares. Actually 39.3% of the shares today in the ordinary. I personally own more than 20% of the shares of the ordinary, coupled with the options that we own. So you're exactly right. I think there's an alignment of interest that is highly unusual on the ASX. And again, these aren't options. These aren't stocks that have been granted, right? These are stocks that have been paid for alongside other shareholders.
And
right? And by the way, I've made open market purchases as well, right? Aside from the capital raise. So I'm very committed to this business. It's indicative of the opportunity that I see. It's also, I would say, indicative of the value that I see. Obviously those 3 capital raises, the backdrop of that was perhaps the most difficult small cap market in the ASX in decades, right? It was very, very difficult to raise capital. And yet Amaero went out and successfully had 3 capital raises, in each case, again, led by Pegasus. But it's positioned us to, we've advanced those milestones along the way. While other companies were having to scramble to raise capital, we maintained a strong balance sheet. We continue to invest in these initiatives, and thus Amaero's position where it is today.
Look, I got to tell you, Hank, I think that's the perfect place to wrap up. I think that you have a very interesting story. I know that we've been in communication and worked closely for some time, and I'm very excited to see where Amaero goes from here. So thanks so much for taking the interest in the story and for having us. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into the disclaimer. Investing money into capital markets involves risk and could result in losing money. The people on this podcast express their own views and may or may not have been paid to appear. Only you can determine if a particular investment is right for your portfolio. Always do your own research before buying or selling any security or investment. Remember, past performance is no guarantee of future results. One should always view any investment with their own personal risk tolerance, liquidity, tax situation, or anything else pertinent in mind. No person on or related to this podcast was making any offer or solicitation.